Hello, Dr. Mashburn here again, and we're going to continue our information or our lectures on the bone. And this is some information that's both lecture material and lab material. So I'm going to kind of give you some ideas of some things that you need to be learning, not only for lecture, but to look for as you start watching your lab videos. So we're going to start classifying our bones, and we're going to talk about how we can classify those bones, and then why we have bone features, what their purpose is. So when you classify bone, there's two ways to classify based on their shape and then what they're made of, so their texture. So the first classification is by the shape, and we give those names long bones, short bones, flat bones, and irregular bones. Those are your four shape types of bones. And as you're learning your bones, as you're watching your lab videos, I want you to pay attention. And sometimes we tell you, sometimes we don't. There's 206 bones, and so we're trying to get through it. So if we don't mention it's a long bone, short bone, flat bone, or regular bone, I want you to go to your textbook and make sure that you understand, what kind of bone it is. So in general, the long bones, they're longer than they are wide. So an example of a long bone would be your humerus, which is in your upper arm, the radius and ulna of your lower arm, the femur of your upper leg, the tibia and fibula of your lower leg. And you'll notice these are really long bones. But don't let that be the only thing that you're looking at. It doesn't just have to be long. It has to be longer than it is wide. So that means the little bitty bones of your foot and your hand, those are also long bones because they're longer than they are wide. Again, so pay attention to where we find our long bones. We have short bones, and these are going to be cube-shaped bones. And we find these in the ankle and the wrist. And there's also some short bones that are called sesamoid bones, and these are bones that form within a tendon. And so the patella, or the knee bone, is an example of a short bone. You have flat bones that are thin, flat, slightly curved. An example of a flat bone would be in your sternum or your breastbone. And then also the bones that surround your brain and your skull, so your cranial cavity bones. And so the one like your occipital bone, your parietal bone, frontal bone, those bones that form your cranium. You'll learn about that in your lab as well. And then your irregular bones, these are bones with complicated shapes, like your bones that make up your vertebrae, your spinal column, the bones that make up the backbone. Those are irregular bones. So again, as you're learning your bones, just pay attention and make sure that you realize how we're classifying. Is it long, short, flat, or irregular? We also classify the bone with their texture, or what they look like, or what they're kind of made of. And so we have compact or lamellar bone, and we have spongy or cancellous bone. So if someone has a floor that's laminated, that means it has layers. So compact bone is layered. And so you're going to see, it looks like almost like tree rings, layers of bone. And compact bone is really strong. Okay? Then you have spongy bone, which looks like a honeycomb. So this would be an example of spongy bone here. Now bones have both. So if you take a bone and cut it open and look inside, you're going to see it has both types of bone. And the compact bone is usually going to be on the outside because it's strong, it gives strength to the bone. And on the inside, you've got the spongy bone, which is an area for your vessels, your nerves, and your bone marrow. So again, bones have both. Compact is the lamellar bone around the outside. Spongy bone is that honeycomb-shaped bone on the inside. The other thing we're going to talk about are your bone markings. Now there are many bone markings, so I didn't put them all in the PowerPoint because you're also going to learn them as you learn your lab, watch your lab videos. And so pay attention when we talk about a bone and we say, okay, now this is the name of the bone. So say example, the humerus. And then we say, okay, we're going to talk about our epicondyles. We're going to talk about our capitulum. We're going to talk about the trochlea. Those are all the features of the bones, okay? The bone markings are the features, and they're important because that's what plays the role. So the bone is there to be a conduit for the muscles, but the muscles have to attach somewhere. So the sites of attachment for muscles and ligaments and bones, we give those areas special names, like a trochanter or a tuberosity or a process. Where two bones come together and form a joint, like between the femur and the tibia where you make your knee joint, you may have a facet or a condyle, somewhere where they can come together and join together. You may have a hole called a meatus or a foramen. And a lot of people want to say meatus and foramen, but it's meatus and foramen. and those are holes in bones for nerves and blood vessels. So again, there's many of these different bone marking names. You'll learn them as we grow through the lab videos. So we'll show you a bone, and we'll say, okay, the name of this bone is, let's just say this is called the, I don't know, that's not even a good bone. Let's make up another bone. Okay, let's say this is the humerus. And then we'll say, okay, we're going to talk about this over here and this over here. And we're going to have our medial and lateral condyles and medial and lateral epicondyles. And we'll say, okay, this is the head. So again, as we talk about the bones, we're going to use lots and lots of different feature names. And you'll need to be able to identify those features on your lab test and be able to spell them. Now, on the lecture test, I want you to understand what the function of the bone feature is. So if I say the femur has a trochanter, you need to look that up and go, okay, that's where some of the muscles attached. Or we talk about the foramen in some of your skull bones. You need to know that's where the nerves and the blood vessels are able to come out. One example of how we use this nomenclature is in the bottom of your skull. There's a big hole called the foramen magnum. So magnum means big, foramen means hole. It's the big hole in the bottom of your skull that your spinal cord comes out. So again, as you're learning your features, just think about what they're doing. Okay, we'll talk about this in your lab as well, but some of it you'll need to look up on your own. All right, so we want to talk about some typical features of bone. And so we're going to take a long bone, and we're going to talk about some parts of this. And this is some of the features you'll learn. So all long bones, again, they're longer than they are wide. Okay, so long, not wide. They have what are called the epiphyses, and epiphyses are really just the ends. Okay, and so when you look at a long bone, it's going to have a proximal epiphysis and a distal epiphysis. Do you remember what proximal means? So toward the trunk, so to the trunk, and then away would be a distal. So if you look at your humerus in your arm, so near your shoulder would be proximal, near your elbow would be distal. Going back to that terminology from our first unit. And so this is important. So if someone has a break in the humerus and the x-ray tech writes down break in the proximal humerus, you know that's going to be closer to the shoulder, or break in the distal epiphysis, that's going to be closer to the elbow. So that's important. So you want to be able to look at a bone. And when we talk about bones and we try to figure out how it is oriented in the body, we're going to talk about, okay, this is the proximal end, this is the distal end. So just make sure you remember what those terms mean. So the middle of the bone is called the diaphysis, and that's also known as the shaft. Okay, so the kind of this part between the two epiphyses, that is the diaphysis, or also known as the shaft. But you'll see this word in our nomenclature for our lab tests instead of shaft. On the ends of the long bones, you're going to see a piece of hyaline cartilage. That's your articular cartilage, so that the bones can articulate or form a joint with another bone. And you're going to see that you have a compact bone on the outside, all right, and then on the inside you've got all this spongy bone. So you basically have a compact bone skeleton or that forms the bone, and then it's filled in the middle with a spongy bone. You have a cavity in the middle called the medullary cavity, and this is where you're going to see your bone marrow. And you also have a periosteum. So peri means around, osteum, bone. So around the bone, you have a membrane that surrounds the bone. And we're going to talk about this as well. The other thing you have, when you look at a long bone, you have an epiphyseal line. And so here and here, you've probably heard these as your growth plates. So your growth plate or your epiphyseal lines. This is where the bone actually grows as it gets longer and longer. And we'll talk about that in more detail too. So let's zoom in and look at that diaphysis, that bone shaft, the diaphysis. When you're looking at bones, they have membranes. And so again, the outside membrane, you have your periosteum. And it's got these fibers called Sharpley's fibers, and these help kind of give the bone strength. Kind of helps hold the bone together and give the bone some strength. You have this compact bone underneath the periosteum, and then just deep to the compact bone you have an inner layer called the endosteum, and then you have the marrow. So the bone marrow is inside that medullary cavity. All right. Now, what are the purposes of these membranes? The endosteum is the inside, the internal surface of the bone, and it has osteoclasts and osteoblasts. So you have your bone builders and bone breaker downers. Do you remember which one's which? Osteoblasts build, osteoclasts break down. You have your periosteum, and that's the outside fibrous layer. And it also has osteoblasts and osteoclasts and osteogenic cells. All right. The periosteum is also where your nerve fibers are, your blood vessels, your lymphatic vessels, and things like that. And they're going to be secured. That periosteum is held to the bone by those Sharpley fibers. And again, it helps kind of give strength to the bone. You've seen this if you've ever eaten ribs, and so after you've barbecued the ribs and you've pulled the meat off, and then you have that kind of that hard, almost clear plasticky stuff that rips off the bone at the end, that's the periosteum. So you guys have probably seen that if you're not vegetarians. All right, so when you're looking at short, irregular, and flat bone, so we just talked about long bone. So what's the difference between the long bone and the short, flat, and irregular? You still have compact bone on the outside, but it's a thin layer. So so when you look at long bones, they've got a pretty thick layer of compact bone because a lot of these long bones are weight bearing. Think about your femur and your tibia. And if you're a four-legged animal, then your humerus and your radius and ulna would also be weight bearing. So these are stronger bones. So the short, irregular, and flat bones, they don't have as much compact bone. They have a thin periosteum covered compact bone. So there's a periosteum and and then they have the endosteum, and you have all of this spongy bone. And you may see the word diploid, and so that's another word for spongy bone, but I don't usually use that, but you may see it. The bone marrow is going to be found in amongst the spongy bone. And spongy bone is made up of what are called trabeculae, and so if you want to say trabeculae means a bunch of T's kind of put together. That's where kind of the word comes from. So you take a bunch of T's and put them together, and you get that honeycomb, spongy-looking bone. All right, so let's go back to what is compact bones. Remember, compact bone is found around the outside of bones, where spongy bone's on the inside. So when you're looking at compact bone, remember I told you it's lamellar bone. It's made up of layers. And so what we're talking about are osteons. And osteons are the structural units of compact bone. And these are these circles of tree rings, okay? So you have these lamella. Each one of the circles is a layer or a lamella. So this would be a lamella, this would be a lamella, this is a lamella. So each one of those layers is a lamella. And that helps you form these weight-bearing columns, okay? So they're long, hard, dense columns that are good for weight-bearing. In the middle of each osteon, so in the middle, you have a central canal, and this is where you're going to have blood vessels and nerves because you've got to have a way to take blood and oxygen and nutrients to the bone-building cells and bone-breaking down cells so they can do their job. You have Volkmann's canals, also called perforating canals, and they're going to connect the central canal. So each osteon is going to be connected to the next osteon and so on and so forth through these little perpendicular canals. You have a lacuna, and again, if you look at a lacuna, that's one of those little cell homes for the osteocytes. I'm going to blow this up in the next picture. And then you have canaliculi, which is a way for these lacuna to be connected. So let's blow this up. So we've blown up an osteon, and so imagine it would go all the way around like a tree ring. So each one of these is a lamella, okay? So each layer is a lamella. This little cell house right here, this is your lacuna, and inside the lacuna you have the osteocyte, okay? So that's the bone cell. You have your artery, the red, you have your blue vein, and your yellow nerve inside your central canal. And then you have these little tubes here, and these are your canaliculi, and so they allow the flow of oxygen and nutrients between these different lamella. So imagine you've got the good stuff, the oxygen and glucose and whatever coming from the artery. It's got to have a way to get all the way out to these cells out here, and so the nutrients, oxygen, diffuse out of the artery, the capillaries, and then they're able to go out into these lamella, and then through these little canaliculi to this cell, and through that little canaliculi to that cell, and then also the other way around. The carbon dioxide, the waste products are able to travel back through the canaliculi back to the central canal. Okay, so Canaliculi just means small canal. All right, so the spongy bone, again, you have trabeculae, and these are these little T's, and they make this honeycomb-shaped bone, but they also align along points of stress. So if you look at a bone, you're going to see kind of a denser amount of trabeculae, and they line up where the bone is going to have the most stress. But so they do provide strength to the bone. They're not as strong as compact bone, but they do provide strength. They don't have osteons. You have this irregular shape to them, and the capillaries, instead of going down those blood vessels and having capillaries that go down those central canals, you just have capillaries and blood vessels kind of going all through the spongy bone. All right, and the last thing I want to talk about when you talk about bone, we've talked about the middle of the bone, the medullary cavity, where your marrow is. Well, that's important because the marrow has a role in making blood cells. And so we call that hematopoietic tissue. So poiesis means to make, and then this means blood cells. So this means to make blood cells. Whoops. Wow, no, sorry. Let me go back. Every once in a while we have a technical glitch. So when you're talking about your hematopoietic tissue, in adults, your bone marrow, as you get older, as we age, that red marrow will turn from this hematopoietic tissue to yellow marrow, which is fat. Okay? In the adults, most of that red marrow has converted to yellow marrow, and the only place you find the red marrow that's still making your blood cells, because you need to make blood cells your entire life, you always need to replace them, just not as quickly as in the infant and the child. Our red marrow cavities are in the heads of the femur and the humerus, and then in bones like your sternum, like your flat bones. Now, in newborns and infants, all of their medullary cavities and all their spongy bone is red marrow. So, again, a child is growing fast. They're constantly making more blood cells, and so they have more red marrow than we do as adults. So as we turn into adults, as we go through puberty and reach adulthood, that red marrow will convert over to yellow marrow, which is fat, and then we use that as a place to store fat, and then we can pull from that in times of famine. We can pull that as a source of energy. Okay, so children don't have that yellow marrow, and then adults do. All right, so that's the end of this video, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you.